We're going to calm things down a little bit now and play a little music of Charles Wakefield Cadman. That might be a name you don't know. Is not very well known now, but was quite popular in the early part of the 20th century. And he was very interested in following the other part of what Dvorak said, is to go listen to Native American music. And there was a group of people who really sort of took that upon themselves and went out to these reservations. There was a guy named Arthur Farwell who started a whole press called the Wawan Press to try to write these Native American tunes down and write pieces based upon them. Cadman was originally born outside of Pittsburgh in 1881, was working for a while as the music critic of the Pittsburgh Dispatch, but began to get this real interest in Native American music, and in the summer of 1909 would end up going out to Nebraska and spending several months at the Omaha and Winnebago reservations, listening to this music, transcribing what he heard, and even was one of the first, there was also an ethnomusicologist from the Smithsonian at the same time. Together they would actually make the first recordings on wax cylinders of these tunes, which are now in the Library of Congress. So he really did some important ethnological research. He met a singer along the way, Nina Redfeather, who was a Cherokee, and together they began to tour around all sorts of places talking about this Native American music and how wonderful it was and how it could be developed in different ways. And ultimately he would write an opera called Shaniwis that was actually premiered by the Metropolitan Opera in 1918 and was so successful that they also did it in 1919, which rarely happens with the Metropolitan Opera. They don't like to do things a couple years in a row, but it was such a huge craze. It really was a big time at that time. He would ultimately make his way out to Los Angeles in the 1920s and was one of the founders of the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra. So he began to start that, and he wrote several film scores for silent films while he was out there. He's written several different chamber music pieces, including a wonderful piano trio from 1913 that I played that has a lot of ragtime influence in it. And then this piece is a violin sonata written around that same time, and the second movement of it takes this Native American tune to begin with, and it takes a nice little journey with that tune, sort of a more, starts in the minor key into the major, builds up, and then comes back to this really quiet moment. So we hope you enjoy the second movement of the Violin Sonata by Charles Cadman. Please welcome back Tim Schwartz. Okay, now we're going to move on to another great American type of music, and that is the blues, which again sort of stems a little bit from ragtime, but also just from its own sources down in the South, the kind of really a folk music that derives from that. And there's no sort of starter, the person who started the blues. It was sort of an oral tradition again. But the man who's known as the father of the blues, the man who sort of codified the language and began to write it down for the first time, was a man named William Christopher Handy, better known as W.C. Handy. He would write some of the first great blues pieces. He grew up in Alabama. His father and grandfather were both ministers. His father believed that all musical instruments were tools of the devil, somehow W.C. Handy was able to buy his first guitar, at which point his father apparently said, "What possessed you to bring a sinful thing like that into our Christian home? Take it back where it came from." So he did not get to keep his first guitar, but he was able to take organ lessons because there was an organ at the church there, and he got pretty good at that. Ultimately started playing trumpet and guitar later on. And he would take this wonderful trip to Mississippi, the rural parts of Mississippi, all through 1902, listening to all of the different black music that was going on there, some of the traditional types. And he apparently had a wonderful ear, and he could go all day listening to these things, and then would go home at night and transcribe what he remembered in his memory, writing these things down, again, getting them down on paper the way that he heard them. And ultimately, he would make his way to Memphis, and in 1909 would write the Memphis Blues, which became sort of the first big blues hit, followed by the Beale Street Blues. And then in 1914, he was in St. Louis, and he wrote a piece called the St. Louis Blues, which we're going to play now. And he writes about the first time he performed that. He says, "The one step and other dances had been done to the tempo of the Memphis Blues. When St. Louis Blues was written, the tango was in vogue. So I tricked the dancers by arranging a tango introduction, and then I broke abruptly into a low-down blues. My eyes swept the floor anxiously, then suddenly I saw lightning strike. The dancers seemed electrified. Something within them came suddenly to life, an instinct that wanted so much to live, to fling its arms, to spread joy, took them by the heels." So that's the story of the St. Louis Blues. Now we're going to play an arrangement of this done by a guy named Joseph Cali-Livolsi, who happens to be Tim's uncle, so he will tell you all about that.
So I come from actually a very musical family, and not only were they a very musical family, it was a family that was very spread out in terms of age. So I was one of those, "Oh wow, that can still happen," babies. And so born quite, I have much older siblings. And my mother was one of two children, her and her sister. And my whole family, my mother and my father actually grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. My mother was extremely poor. Her father was a violinist during the Depression, so you can imagine that was a real moneymaker. And he taught his older daughter, Kay, and she was actually extremely talented. And she went to the University of Louisville, and then after that said, "I'm going to take the train to New York." They'd never been out of Louisville in their life. "I'm taking the train to New York, I'm going to audition for Juilliard," and she told her parents, "If I get in, you will probably never see me in Louisville again." And that happened. She got into Juilliard, she actually went there. My mother later did the similar thing, but this time to Harvard, and became a physicist, and was actually one of two female physicists in the entire country. But since she's not a musician, we won't talk about that too much. But what's really fascinating is that a lot of these things that Dan talks about with like sort of throughout history, really I saw with my family. And my aunt, she was a rather wild character. After going through a few husbands, she eventually settled on one who was 25 years older than her, who was Joseph Cali-Livolsi, also a wonderful violinist who played a lot in Broadway. So because of this age gap, if my uncle were still alive, he'd be 127. So that gives you kind of a little bit of an idea. And his piano teacher studied with Brahms. So it's really not, it's amazing the connection. He was in New York like when Gershwin was really becoming of age, really doing his thing. He played a lot of Broadway, a lot of shows. The list of people that he played with is just extraordinary. He wrote this great arrangement. He also wrote an arrangement of Gershwin's Summertime, which he took to the publisher, and they said, we love it, but unfortunately we can't publish it. And he said, why? And they said, because Jascha Heifetz is about to publish his Porgy and Bess stuff, and we don't want any competition. You know what I mean? So it was very interesting to see that. Just another little tidbit about my aunt. Even though going to Juilliard, and she actually was the first one to perform like the Bartok Violin Concerto with the Juilliard Orchestra. They specifically asked her, I very innocently, when I was maybe 9 or 10, asked her like, so why didn't you ever audition for the New York Philharmonic? She said, well, women were not allowed to do that. You know, so, you know, it does show how things have really changed. But this is a great, really fun piece. He did quite a few arrangements. His son actually arranged something we're going to play later on. And what I love about it is that it really has like a little bit of everything. There's a little bit of salsa. There's of course, you know, the blues. And as a friend of mine pointed out, there's like a tiny 2-measure quote from the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto that he actually throws in, which you probably, I think you'll miss it if it just goes by like that. But it's a really fun piece. Hope you enjoy.
composer who really loved the blues and then tried to sort of take it out and put it more into sort of Western classical music was a guy named William Grant Still, who's sadly been forgotten for the most part, but he was known as the Dean of African American classical composers and wrote lots of different pieces, including a lot of firsts for an African American. He was the first to have a symphony of his performed by a major symphony orchestra. That was his Afro-American Symphony, which is an incredibly great piece of music, which you can still hear on YouTube. That was performed in 1933 by the Rochester Philharmonic. He was also the first African American to conduct a major symphony orchestra. That was the Los Angeles Philharmonic in 1936. He conducted that. Then it took another 20 years before he became the first to conduct a symphony orchestra in the Deep South when he conducted the New Orleans Philharmonic in 1955. He was also the first to have an opera produced by a major company, the New York City Opera, put on his Troubled Island with a libretto by Langston Hughes in 1949. And he actually wrote 4 different operas. He had actually gone to Oberlin. He was from Mississippi, went off to Oberlin University in music school, which was at that time the only place that would accept African American students, and was a great student there. He then, after he graduates, goes to Memphis and meets up with W.C. Handy, and he actually helps write down some of the blues that Handy had been working on, and does that for a year or so. Then he goes off to fight in World War I. Then he comes back to the United States and ends up in New York at the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, and spends the next several years there. In fact, he was in the pit band playing oboe. He played a lot of instruments, but he played oboe in the first all-black musical that was done called Shuffle Along, with music by U.B. Blake and Noble Sisson. That was in 1921, and he was there for that. And he became very good friends. He also worked with Paul Whiteman and Artie Shaw and many others. But he became friends with many of the great artists and writers, including Langston Hughes, of course. He would ultimately end up in Los Angeles, where he lived out his days and actually ended up arranging several film scores, including Pennies from Heaven, starring Bing Crosby in 1936, Lost Horizon in 1937. Now, the piece that we're going to play, unfortunately, I'd love to play the whole piece, but it's too long, but we're going to play the third movement of this piece. And it's a violin suite that he wrote in 1945. And what he was trying to do with this, as he said, was to elevate the blues, which had always been sort of low class, into a more sort of classical, high refined piece. So the 3 movements are all based upon works of art by friends of his from the Harlem Renaissance. The first movement is based upon a sculpture. This was the first sculpture by an African American to get into the Whitney Museum, and it's still there. I just saw it the last time I was at the Whitney. Richmond Barte's Tribal Dancer, and the first movement of this piece is as if the dancer has come alive and is whirling around with this great fervor, and there's a wonderful blues section in the middle of that. The second movement sounds much like a spiritual. It just has one of the most beautiful second movements based upon a crayon drawing by Sergeant Claude Johnson of a mother and child. The movement we're going to play, the third movement, is based upon a woman's sculpture, Augusta Savage. That is also, I believe, in the Whitney. I just saw it. Is the title of it is Gamin, or sort of a street urchin. And you get in here a sense of the boogie woogie that is starting there, this real fun style of music that really captures the essence of a young kid in play. So here's the third movement of the suite by William Grant Still. strong influence in our American music, and that is the Jewish influence. There's about 1/3 of the Jewish population of Eastern Europe would eventually would make their way into New York and other parts of the United States in the decades from about 1890 to 1910, escaping the pogroms there. And they brought with them their music, the klezmer music. And those of you who have seen our Jewish jazz concert, I've talked about how that klezmer and American jazz sort of blended in a wonderful way and really developed through the bending of the sound of the klezmer music. Also, the liturgical music in Judaism would find its way, and especially that sort of special scale, what you call that kind of very Jewish scale that has that augmented second, and that began to get picked up by a lot of the great composers, and most of the early great American songwriters, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, they were all Jewish. The only one who wasn't was Cole Porter, they used, so they remembered, many of them had gone to synagogues and had heard that music, and some of that would make its way into what we now call our American Broadway songbook. But what we're going to play is a little bit more tied to sort of the liturgical Jewish religion, and it's done by a composer named Ernest Bloch, who was not born an American, but he did die a U.S. citizen. He was born in Geneva, Switzerland in 1880, was a really fabulous violinist, toured all over the place. He did grow up Jewish, but kind of more culturally and intellectually Jewish, didn't spend a lot of time in synagogue. But at some point he ends up in Paris, and he meets up with a friend who's sort of a Jewish friend who begins to talk about the Bible and all the great stuff in there. And he begins to sort of reread it, and he has this sort of new fascination with what his Jewish tradition. He said, "It is the Jewish soul that interests me, the complex, glowing, agitated soul that I feel vibrating throughout the Bible. The freshness and naivete of the patriarchs, the violence of the books of the prophets, the Jews' savage love of justice, the despair of Ecclesiastes, the sorrow and immensity of the book of Job, the sensuality of the Song of Songs. It is all this that I strive to hear in myself and to translate in my music, the sacred emotion of the race that slumbers deep in our soul." And so he writes a number of really important Jewish-based pieces. They're a little bit more biblically, they're not so religious, but they're sort of this grand idea that he's trying to elevate Judaism into this wonderful way to incorporate music. Now, he ultimately would find his way to the United States. Actually, in a funny way, he was playing violin, in an orchestra that was coming to the United States, that was doing ballet. They got to the United States, but apparently they ran out of money in Ohio. And he got stuck in Ohio and ended up making his way back into New York and very quickly finding some work to do. He actually became the first teacher of composition at the Mannes School of Music in New York, which had just opened around then. Soon after that, he was hired to be the first director of the Cleveland Institute of Music that opened up in 1920. And a few years after that, he would be hired by the San Francisco Conservatory of Music when they started up in 1925. So he was a very important pedagogue and mentor to a lot of other students as well. He would end up retiring in Agate Beach, Oregon, and he actually was a fantastic photographer as well. He was friends with Alfred Stieglitz, one of the great photographers, and some of his photography is absolutely gorgeous. It's been in museums. And actually one of his sons, Lucien Bloch, was also a photographer and actually took the only photograph of the Diego Rivera mural that was done at the Rockefeller Center that was covered up because it had Lenin in it, but we have a picture of that because of Lucien Bloch. Now, while he was in New York in 1918, April of 1918, he happened to go to a Hasidic service on the Lower East Side, and he had never been to one of those. And the Hasidic folks, they sort of believed in the power of a song to elevate the soul, to achieve kind of the state of transcendence and this kind of ecstatic religious idea. But they didn't do it, there were no musical instruments. It was just sort of a very personalized, direct way to God. And the Hasidic religion had been started by Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer in the 1700s, and he was known as Baal Shem Tov. And so the suite that he would write, called Baal Shem, was sort of dedicated to this. He didn't write the piece right away, but he wrote this letter to his mother after attending the service, and he said the following: "There was no organ, no instruments, no choir. Everyone was his own orchestra. Everything was vibrant, living, creating an extraordinary atmosphere. I dissolved with emotion. I assure you that my music seems to me a very poor little thing beside that which I just heard. You will understand everything that this experience means for me. It's a great joy, but it is also extreme sorrow. For my life has now been split in two. I would have been able, as a single man, to plunge myself into this truth, even at my age, letting it live anew in me, and creating a formidable work, linking this granite past to the present, to the future, but alas, I cannot. He had his family and children all then, but he kept that spirit, the feeling with him. And in 1923, he would write this Baal Shem suite, or Three Scenes from Hasidic Life, as it is also known. We're going to do the second one of these called Nigfun, which really just means a kind of improvisation towards God. And you'll hear in this that direct sort of a spirit, the direct connection to God with this sort of really painful, using that Jewish scale, rising to this amazing climactic moment in the middle. One last quote I want to do. Bloch, although very Jewish, always kept a crucifix in his office as well, and people were sort of confused by that, but he really didn't believe in the superiority of any religion. He believed in justice and tolerance of all kind, and he said once, "Spiritual values never die. The universal idea must prevail. This crucial idea has permeated all my life and most of my works. My ultimate faith and belief is in the unity of man, in spite of real racial dissimilarities. My faith is in justice on earth, on the right of each man to live his life as decently and usefully, giving to the community what he has to give according to his gifts. This is the great idea of our prophets, and in many ways the ideals of all religions, like Confucius, Buddha, and Christ." So we hope you enjoy Nigfun by Ernest Bloch. that I think you will recognize. It's a medley of songs from the wonderful show West Side Story. This is a work that came out in 1955, of course, written by the great Leonard Bernstein, or Bernstein, I should say. I keep hearing him saying that wrong. He grew up in Boston, and one of his first musical experiences was at a synagogue there in Boston, so he heard some of this music, and he really sort of played around with all kinds of styles of music, got very into Latin music at some point, and of course would use that in the West Side Story as well. He was a fantastic conductor as well, and as a young man, sort of sat in for the New York Philharmonic at a last minute and did an amazing program, I think in 1943. Also one of the greatest teachers of all time. His young people's concerts, which you can see, really just great explanations of music, and just he was a fantastic person to understand how music moves our souls. Now this West Side Story, actually, he and Arthur Lawrence who wrote the book, had this idea of making an updated version of Romeo and Juliet for a while. And in the 1940s, they sort of came up with a working title, which was going to be East Side Story. And it was going to be about an Irish Catholic guy falling in love with a Jewish woman. But they decided that had been done before, that it didn't really want to go with the religious stuff, so they kind of put it on hold. And then over the 1950s, there was a huge influx of Puerto Ricans into the west side of New York, and they thought that would make it better. They could bring in some of that Latin music, have it against. That is how West Side Story was born. Although many people thought the show really just was too hard to put on. They needed a whole bunch of young people dancing and singing. As he said once, everyone told us that West Side Story would be an impossible project. They said the score was too rangy to sing. Besides, who wants to see a show in which the first act curtain comes down on two dead bodies lying on the stage? Then we had the really tough problem of casting the show, because the characters had to be able not only to sing, but to dance and act and be taken for teenagers. Ultimately, some of the cast were teenagers. Some were 21, some were 30, but they sure looked like they were 16. Some were wonderful singers, but couldn't dance very well, or vice versa. And if they could do both, they couldn't act a lick. Somehow they came out with a pretty good show, and then a movie out that, and very successful. Bernstein also was sort of a great humanitarian, understood the power of music against evil forces. He was there when the Berlin Wall came down, and he said once, "This will be our reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devotedly than ever before. Only music can name the unnameable and communicate the unknowable." Now, this arrangement, actually, of West Side Story was written for Timothy Schwartz. It is written by his cousin, Lawrence Livolsi, the son of Joseph Cali-Livolsi, who we heard with the St. Louis Blues. Unfortunately, Lawrence just died earlier this year, so we do this in his honor. He wrote this just before we went on our tour through the Middle East, and we played West Side Story, and it's shocking when they're singing Maria in Pakistan. I mean, they knew this music. It's a really wonderful arrangement. Many of the great songs are in there. There's a beautiful dedication that he wrote, which says the following. This arrangement of West Side Story is written for and dedicated to Timothy Schwartz. His talent, along with his sensitivity and dedication to his instrument, knows no boundaries. I wish every good fortune in the pursuit of his musical career. Enjoy West Side Story.